Welcome everyone. I'm Charles Bernard. I paint paperback book covers, and I have an online art school called the Online Art Academy, where I have a course called the Complete Illustration Art Course. You'll be learning all of the core fundamentals. You'll get an entire art education from this course, and it has been specifically designed for those of you who want to become illustrators. But of course, the principles you'll be learning can also be applied to concept art, or for that matter, even fine art. I used to work for the famous artists' schools, and here you see a textbook from one of their courses. This textbook is the famous artist painting course. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you a few pages from this textbook to help explain what I'm going to be teaching. This video is unlike any other video that you're going to see on this subject. This is a very long video, so this video is not for those of you who just want to watch 10-15-minute videos and not really gain an in-depth understanding and knowledge of the subject. Here you have an opportunity to learn a lot about this subject that I'm going to be covering. So if you're only a 10-15-minute sort of student, then this video, of course, is not for you. But if you are the kind of student who is willing to watch a long video because you know you're going to be learning a lot, then this video is for you. And you're the kind of student that has the best chance at becoming really good at drawing and painting. Most likely you might not be able to watch the entire video in one session. So if you can't watch it in one session, then just break it up into how many sessions you need in order to be able to see the entire video. So you watch a certain amount of the video, then when you have to stop it, you stop the video, and then when you can come back and watch more of the video, you come back and restart the video where you left off. And now I'm going to be showing you some paintings that will show you what this video is going to teach you. What I'm going to be showing you now are various paintings done by different artists in a style that is referred to as semi-abstract. This video is about teaching you how to paint in that kind of more semi-abstract style. What the concepts are that will enable you to paint in that kind of style. If you've only always heard about realistic looking paintings of the subject, and you've always only been taught to use perspective, well, then what I'm going to be showing you here is quite different from what you're used to hearing about and seeing in paintings. Here you're going to see a style that is extremely pleasing to the eyes, that many people love, over the so-called very realistic kind of paintings. This was done by Alfred Chadbourne, or like this, another Alfred Chadbourne painting, or like this. This was done by Frank Webb, the great watercolor painter. Or do you want to paint in a style like this, which is another Frank Webb watercolor painting? Or maybe like this, which was done by Robert Baxter, an illustrator and fine art painter, one of my favorite artists. Or you want to paint like this, another Robert Baxter painting. Or like that, and again, another Robert Baxter painting. This is an illustration for McCall's magazine. And let me show you another Robert Baxter painting, this one here. And what a beauty this is. There is an incredible amount of knowledge and skill that goes into the making of pictures like this. You have to want to know what it is that goes into the making of pictures. Like this. Do you want to paint in that kind of style? Which is a style similar, but not exactly the same, like what I've been showing you. But they all have something in common, which is that the artist paints in a more semi-abstract style, not a very realistic style. This was painted by the artist Nicola Cimbari, and let me show you another one that he painted. This one here. In this video, you're going to learn what goes into the making of this kind of style of painting. To be able to paint like this, you have to really be dedicated to wanting to paint like this, to wanting to know what goes into the making of something like this. Otherwise, you're never going to learn it, and you're never going to be able to paint like this or like any of the other paintings that I showed you. So if this style is something that inspires you to want to paint, does it make you want to pick up your brush and start painting? Or when you look at this, does it inspire you to want to paint? Or this? If it does nothing for you, then this video is not for you. Then you're not going to be the kind of art student that is dedicated to learning what goes into the making of a painting like that. Or this. This video is for the serious student of art who wants to become a really good artist, who wants to know what this artist did to make this painting look so incredibly interesting and beautiful. And if you're that kind of student, then you're going to be able to watch this 3-hour-long video. Here you have an opportunity to learn something in depth, to learn what those building blocks are that go into the making of something like that. Or this. While there are many concepts involved in being able to paint like this, what I'm going to show you next is just 2 of the concepts or elements, one of which I will be pointing out to you that goes into this sort of style. Here's a quick, rough color sketch that I did that shows what this style that I'm showing in this video is about. And in this style, it's the local value and the local color that becomes important. So, in other words, it's mass over form. Form is what you see here. This is chiaroscuro. This creates a feeling or an appearance of a solid 3-dimensional form, while this is about mass, which refers to value or color. You could have value masses or color masses, and when the painting is more about mass, then the painting is more about a more flat kind of style, which is what you see in my color sketch there. And I'm going to turn it into black and white so you can see the value masses. Dark values, lighter values, masses of color, and masses of tone. So here's the masses of color, here's the masses of tone. Everything is kept more flat looking, but not completely flat. There are subtle tonal and color variations within these masses. Now, I didn't take this as far as I could have, but it's enough to show you or give you some idea of what I'm talking about here. And here, it's the local color that you see and the local values. And this helps to flatten out the entire painting more, bring everything more toward the picture plane. And I'll be talking a lot more about that later in the video. So this represents 2 different styles. And when you're painting in the more flat style, that should dominate. You could also have some form in that style of painting, but there needs to be more of one or the other. Otherwise, it's going to get really confusing looking. So in my color sketch, there isn't any confusion as to which of these I'm using, because all of this is more mass rather than form. There's a lot to learn about this approach to painting. Therefore, this is such a long video. But pretty much all of the building blocks that result in this kind of semi-abstract style are to be found in this video. If you have the interest and desire to want to learn, then this video will teach you what you need to know to be able to paint in this more semi-abstract style. But even though you might want to work in a more realistic style rather than this more semi-abstract style, there are things in this video that you'll learn that you could also apply to more realism. To paint in this more abstract, realistic style, which is actually a kind of more flat-like painting, not flat, I'm saying more flat-like. That doesn't mean it It's flat like wallpaper. There's still form there. There's still depth. And in order to be able to paint in the style that you're going to be seeing in the examples that I'm going to be showing you, and you already saw a few of them at the beginning of the video, you will need to know what those concepts are that will enable you to paint in that style. And those concepts are the spatial concepts that Cezanne came up with, although some of those spatial concepts existed even before Cezanne. So I'm going to be showing you what those concepts are and how they're applied. And now I want to show you the kind of paintings that can be done when these concepts of space that Cezanne applied to his paintings are applied to your paintings. And you'll see the kind of style that results. And I'll show you more examples of this kind of style later in the video. And when you see these paintings, they may appeal to you in such a way that they might inspire you to want to change your style if your style is more realistic. And it is a style in which this becomes all important. And design is all about how you apply direction, color, value, pattern, shape, textures to your paintings. And the way they are applied are according to principles of design. For example, you will need to apply the principle of repetition. If you don't apply the principle of repetition, you're not applying design, because repetition is one of those design principles. So it's something like this, for example. This is a painting by Frank Webb, and Frank Webb applies the principle of repetition. So if you're going to apply design to your paintings, then you need to apply repetition. But it's not repetition without variation. So what you need to do is apply repetition with variation. You need to know what that looks like, how that's done, and I can't go into all of that here. But I will briefly point out the repetition that Frank Webb uses, and when it comes to shape, he is repeating the rectangle shape, you see? And then he varies it so that it looks more like a square, then a rectangle here, and then here's a really long one, large size. Then he repeats that shape, you see, with variations, that is, variations of size, different sizes. So he is applying design, which is extremely important in this kind of style. This style is all about design. So if you don't know design, you can't paint in that kind of style. But of course, the principle of design, repetition, is also applied to other styles of painting as well. But in the style that I'm showing you in this video, design becomes extremely important. It's all about design. When talking about design, the student must also learn color design, which goes into the making of this style that I'm showing you in this video. This painting was done by Robert Baxter, an incredible artist, illustrator, and fine arts painter. And at one time, he was a student at the famous artist schools. He absorbed everything the school had to teach, and eventually he began illustrating for publishers. He did a lot of paperback book covers, and later turned to fine art painting. This looks to me like an illustration that he did, as opposed to a fine art painting. And I selected this painting to show you because of the color design that he applied. In addition, this style represents the style that I'm talking about in this video, which is a more flat-like style of painting. And in this video, when I mention chiaroscuro, that may be part of this more flat-like style, the chiaroscuro is minimized in order to flatten out the pictorial space more by having the forms appear more flat and not as voluminous and three-dimensional as they would appear when chiaroscuro is applied more strongly. In this painting, you can see that chiaroscuro is applied in a more subtle way. So what Baxter does, he doesn't create a strong contrast between the light side of the face and the shadow. The intervals of values on the value scale are closer, not further apart. And therefore, the difference between the tone in the light and the tone in the shadow are not as strong. And this helps to flatten out the form more, but not entirely. There's still form there. But it's presented in a more subtle way, in keeping with this idea of a more shallow space in which everything comes closer to the picture plane. So when you look at that face, you can see that the value here isn't a whole lot different from what the value here is in the shadow. I'm going to turn it into a black and white, and you can see the values better. You see? See how close those values are to each other? There's no strong light and shadow contrast. So if you're going to be painting in this more flat-like style, then you have to minimize chiaroscuro if you're using it, although some artists might not use it at all. So when it comes to color in this painting, Baxter uses two strong contrasting hues, which are the red-orange of the heads placed against the cool blue in back of the heads. When you have two strong opposing hues like this, they need to be integrated. Why? Well, in order to form a unity. Since unity is the most important principle of design, and establishing strong unity in this style that I'm showing you in this video is extremely important. So how does Baxter unify these two opposing hues, these two opposing warm, cool hues? Well, Baxter does it by way of value, and I'm going to turn this back into a black and white, and you can see that the value on the faces is the same value as the blue surrounding the faces, or at least very similar. And by having the values very similar like this, the two opposing warm, cool hues are integrated. An alliance is formed between them, and thereby a unity is established, so that these two different hues are not isolated from each other in the painting. They relate to each other because they both have a very similar value to them. I pointed this out in one of my videos on color design that you might have seen, in which I talked a lot more about this idea of unifying opposing hues and how important that is. Not sure if everyone really understood what I was teaching in that video, but if you understood it, and you understand what I'm talking about here, and you apply this to your own paintings, you're going to see a dramatic improvement in your color design. Now, let me return it to color. Watch what happens when I change the value and intensity of the color on the faces. Now, the contrast looks too harsh, too stark. The color and value don't seem to be part of the rest of the painting. They look too isolated from the rest of the painting. The value of the faces is too different from the value of the background blue. And let me turn this back into black and white so you can see the difference in values. Now you can see how different the value of the faces is compared to the value of the blue in back of the faces. And because there is this big difference in value, as well as in the intensity of the color, there's no integration of the color of the faces with the surrounding value and color. Baxter knew that that would happen if he painted the faces like that. And what would happen if he applied a stronger chiaroscuro, like this, for example. Now the faces look like they have too much form, too voluminous looking, compared to the style of the rest of the painting, which is more flat-like. Therefore, Baxter knew that he had to reduce the chiaroscuro, like that, and reduce the value and intensity of the color like that. Now, doesn't that look much better? Now the color and the modeling of the faces are more in keeping with the rest of the style of the painting, which is a more flat-like style, but not entirely flat when it comes to the faces. The characters in the background there look more flat compared to the faces, because it's the faces that Baxter wants you to look at more than anything else in the painting. So they're made a bit more elaborate looking than other parts of the painting. Because of what Baxter did here, a beautiful harmony is established in this painting. Design needs to be thought of in terms of creating relationships within the painting. It's all about relationships. How does this color relate to that other color? how does that value relate to the value surrounding it? Is this color a little too warm compared to that other color next to it? Should it be cooled down a bit, or should it be made even warmer? And when you're able to exaggerate the principles of design, then you'll end up with something like this. But you also need to understand what it means to exaggerate the principles of design. But not only the principles of design are applied in this kind of style of painting. In order to arrive at this kind of style, you also need to apply the spatial concepts that I'm going to be showing you in this video that the great Cezanne applied to his paintings, and that after him many other artists applied to their paintings, which resulted in a whole new way of painting and ushered in modern art. So in this painting by Baxter, he is applying these spatial concepts that I'll be going over and explaining them. But learning these concepts and being able to apply them to your own paintings is not something that's going to happen quickly by just watching this video once and then that's it. It's going to take hard work. You're going to have to watch this video who knows how many times and carefully study everything that I'm showing in this video and carefully trying to apply it to painting. If this is the kind of style that appeals to you, these are the kind of things that you just can't learn from short art instruction videos that are 10, 15, or 20 minutes long. It's not going to happen for you if you think you're going to be able to learn these things quickly and then quickly being able to apply them to your paintings. It's just not going to happen. There's a lot to learn, a lot to understand, and that's why this video is a very long video. And if you don't have that strong desire to want to learn what goes into the making of paintings like this or like this, then it's just not going to happen for you. You're never going to be able to paint at this level. Just look at how incredible this looks. Someone who wants to become an artist is going to be inspired by paintings like this or like this, to want to learn, to want to paint, to want to watch art instruction videos 2 hours, 3 hours, even 4 hours. You never get tired of wanting to learn more and more so that you too can paint like this. If that strong desire isn't there, then I don't think it's going to happen for you. By applying these Cezanne spatial concepts, you'll be able to paint at this level, this kind of style, in which design becomes all important. So this is another Robert Baxter painting. He's one of my favorite artists. He's both an illustrator and a fine artist. And what he applies to his fine art paintings, he also applies to his illustrations. Here again, some of these Cezanne spatial concepts can be seen like one of the concepts of what is called open patterns. Open value and open color patterns, for example. And an open value pattern can be seen right here, where the woman's hair is, and then the background here. Both the woman's hair and the background are dark, and they merge or fuse together into one shape. And when that happens, you have what is called an open pattern, an open value pattern, as opposed to a closed value pattern. One of the things that Baxter does in this illustration is that he doesn't complete the entire illustration. You see over here and down here, that isn't really finished. It doesn't add detail over here or some kind of description of something going on over here. No, he leaves that empty, blank, except for the line that you see there, and then he leaves out the character's legs here. Not necessary. Someone else might say, well, look at that illustration. He didn't finish it. It looks unfinished. Well, it's supposed to look unfinished. That is, part of it should look unfinished. That was Baxter's intention. Now, let me show you another superb painting by Baxter, this one here. And again, in this one, Baxter is applying these Cezanne spatial concepts that results in this kind of style. It's a more flat, abstract style, and you can see the more abstract, flat shape here of the woman's dress, like that. The background is an abstract shape, like this, coming around, and Baxter uses a more compressed space, which is what I'm going to be talking about later and showing you. Baxter wants to bring the background here forward more, so he makes a static plane of the background that has height and width going across like that. And because it's a static plane, it comes forward toward the picture plane. And also this abstract shape, because it looks rather flat, it also comes forward toward the picture plane. Baxter doesn't use chiaroscuro, which would result in a style that looks too volumetric, not more flat. But of course, this isn't completely flat. There is subtle modeling of tone going on here to keep it from looking too flat. In this kind of style of painting, what becomes important are the local colors and local values, not the light and shadow or chiaroscuro or perspective. What's important are the shapes. What kind of shape is made? The shape becomes important. And it's the shape of what the local value and local color is, without that light and shadow, that chiaroscuro. So now let me show you a painting by a different artist. This was done by Frank Webb, and he too uses these Cezanne spatial concepts to flatten out the space more. It's a more flat style of painting, where again the emphasis is on design, on shapes, on pattern, on applying the principles of design and exaggerating them wherever he can. Webb paints in a more shallow space, not deep space. So therefore everything comes forward more, closer to the picture plane. And I'll be talking about that later and showing you exactly how that works. So if you learn these spatial concepts, and you know the principles of design, and you understand that painting is about establishing relationships, not painting things, but painting relationships, then you too will be able to paint pictures like this. If this is the kind of style that appeals to you, I know that I love this style. And I could look at a painting like this for many minutes, never get really tired of looking at it. Let me show you another painting by Frank Webb. And here, as you can see, there is a dominance of more saturated colors. And again, like in his previous painting, Frank Webb applies these spatial concepts that flatten out the space more. He applies more flat shapes of color, but then he adds color variations within those shapes. Warm colors, cool colors, all mingled together, as you can see, applying the principle of gradation and other principles, which then result in a painting like this that is a feast for the eyes. You're going to see later in this video that I talk about the spatial concept of perspective and chiaroscuro, that they are not part of this sort of style of painting. However, they can be part of this style because, as I'll mention, these concepts can be applied in a more minimized way, which means, for example, when it comes to perspective, the artist isn't going to follow the rules of perspective perfectly, so that the edges of shapes, they all move in the direction toward a vanishing point on a horizon. So the artist may use perspective, but not use it in a perfect way in order to flatten out the pictorial space more. But nevertheless, it's going to be used to a certain extent by some artists, while others may ignore it completely. But Frank Webb doesn't always ignore it completely. You can't say that an artist always does something in the same old way always. No, he may or may not use more or less of perspective or chiaroscuro. It all depends on what effect he or she is after. So in order to represent this subject in a way so that the building looks more like a building and has some volume to it, Frank Webb applies a certain degree of perspective. But it's not perfect perspective. It looks like he's just adding the perspective, not by drawing perfect lines that go toward a vanishing point. No, it looks more like he's doing it by eye, what looks more or less right to him, and what seems to flatten out the space a bit more. So while he is applying perspective in order to get this appearance of a building. He's not applying perfect perspective. So let me show you what he's doing. So there's the horizon line. Then the edge of this dock has a perspective line. And if you continue that line, eventually way over toward the right, it's going to come to the horizon and a vanishing point. But when you look at the opening here and the edge of that shape, and I'm going to draw that line, you can see that that line is not going to go toward a vanishing point that this line here is going toward. So you see this imperfect perspective. And the same goes for the other side of the dock. So it's something like this. But then the edge of the roof here, which should be going in this direction, so that eventually it will meet the horizon and a vanishing point. But as you can see, the roof doesn't do that. So the edge of the roof is going in this direction. So again, imperfect perspective. And the same for the roof up here, the top of the roof. That line, continued like that, isn't moving down in that direction toward the horizon. And then also this roof here, the edge of that roof, is moving in that direction. Not down like that toward the vanishing point. So in perfect perspective, all these lines would be moving toward a vanishing point, but they're not. They're going all over the place. But nevertheless, even though this is not perfect perspective, there's enough perspective here to give you the impression of a building sitting there on top of the dock that has some volume to it. Now, another one of these spatial concepts is chiaroscuro. And in this more flat style of painting, many times chiaroscuro is avoided, but not always. It all depends on what the style is that the artist is after. So when chiaroscuro is used, it may be used in a minimized way, so that there is a subtle difference between the light and the shadow. Not a strong difference in which there is gradation from the light to the shadow or from the shadow to the light. That is a gradation of tone, which would then create a more solid three-dimensional object that has volume. So in this painting, you don't see that kind of chiaroscuro. But you do see strong differences in value. And I'm going to turn it into a black and white so you can see the values. So you see a dark tone for the shadow, and then you see the tone for the light. And there is strong value contrast between the shadow and the light, as you can see. And this helps to create a feeling of form so that the building here doesn't look completely flat. That's not what Frank Webb wants. So where he does want a feeling of volume and form, and he doesn't want the subject to look too flat, he'll use this kind of stronger light and shadow value contrast. But that doesn't mean that he always does this. And since in this sort of style of painting, realism isn't important, you don't have to be realistic with your use of color. Frank Webb is not painting something that is supposed to look like reality. He's creating his own reality. So he doesn't make the sky blue. He makes the sky yellow-orange. And he doesn't make the water blue. He makes it green. Why does he do this? Well, because this creates more interesting color relationships, more exciting looking color. Remember, this is all about design, not creating a replica of reality. In Frank Webb's reality, you can have green water, yellow-orange sky during the daytime, not when the sun is setting. And in the reality that Frank Webb is creating here, he's making the rocks over here blue. There are no blue rocks, but in his reality that he is creating here, there are blue rocks. And blue posts that are holding up the dock, unless those posts have been painted blue, but their natural color is more of a brown rather than blue. So Frank is changing the color of the posts so that that color contrasts more sharply with the warmer colors in the painting, creating a more exciting looking color design. And here again, you see he's thinking of design when it comes to color. What kind of color relationships will make for a really interesting color design? Not in how accurate can I be, painting the subject the way it actually looks. A more literal-minded artist would think that way, but a more creative artist would not. Working in this sort of style allows the artist to be more creative, more inventive, more free, more spontaneous. Therefore, many artists prefer to work in this sort of style rather than this style here. Now, this is more realistic or more representational of what the subject actually looks like than what you find in the Frank Webb painting. Now, this sort of style may appeal to you more than this style. It's up to you. Whatever appeals to you more, that's the style you should be painting in. Whatever feels more natural to you, whatever comes more easily to you. So this is a more painterly style. It's painted with a bit more looseness, not so tight, where everything has to be perfectly painted and constructed. I find this style much more appealing than styles in which the artist tries to be too realistic, tightens up too much, puts in too much detail. This painting was painted by one of the art instructors at the famous artist schools. And if you want to know how the artist painted this, what process he went through to paint this, I made a video on that famous artist school's painting process. And that video might still be at my YouTube channel, so you might want to check that out. To be able to paint something like this, you need some kind of orderly process to follow. And in that video that I made, I'll show you what that orderly process is. And now let me show you another painting that was done by a different artist. This artist is Alfred Chadbourne, and he used to be an art instructor at the famous artist schools. And here again, you see this more abstract-like style. It's not strictly realistic. And some of these spatial concepts that Cezanne used in his paintings are applied here. Flat, simple shapes are applied. Some planes are parallel with the picture plane. Other planes are more dynamic, going into depth. Perfect perspective is not adhered to, but you still get a feeling of correct construction of the houses, even though they don't correspond perfectly to perfect perspective. While the focus is on a more flat look, there's still a feeling of form. Some of the foreground buildings have some volume to them. They're not completely flat. Some others further back look more flat. So just like with the other artists that I showed you, the style results from following those Cezanne spatial concepts. In this painting, you don't get that more shallow space that you get in many of Chadbourne's paintings. While he does use a two-dimensional flat plane in the water here, it has height and width, but you don't get that kind of feeling of deep space of the water going way back into the distance. The plane of that water is parallel to the picture plane, so it comes forward. But nevertheless, there's a greater feeling of depth in this painting than in many of Chadbourne's other paintings, because you see these smaller shapes way back in the distance there. So you get a feeling of depth or distance going way back into the distance like that, but at the same time, there's also a feeling of flatness here because of that two-dimensional plane of the water. There are different kinds of pictorial space. There's deep space, there's limited space, or as I call it here in this video, shallow space. There are different names that can be used. The idea is that there's going to be less space than the kind of space you get by applying what is called scientific perspective or deep space perspective. Artists create virtual space. They don't create actual space. You can't go into the painting. It's virtual space, so the artist needs to know how to create this feeling of space or depth or distance within the painting. And in this video, I'm not going to be concerned with scientific perspective or accurate linear perspective. Rather, this video is more about more shallow or limited space. So in this more shallow or limited space painting, design becomes all important, And naturalistic or scientific perspective rules are actually reversed in order to create a more shallow space so that the eye doesn't travel way back into the distance towards some vanishing point, which is what Cezanne wanted to avoid in his paintings, and therefore he applied certain spatial concepts that I'm going to be showing you in this video that reduced deep space to a more shallow space, and therefore a more flat kind of style is the result. But it's not completely flat, because when you look at Cezanne's paintings, they have form. They're not completely flat shapes, but these forms exist within a limited space. And to create that more limited space, Cezanne resorted to these spatial concepts. If you're going to be painting in this more shallow kind of space, the style is going to be more flat-like, but not completely flat, as I'll be pointing out in this video. So therefore, there's still going to be some form, but you're going to establish planes that are parallel to the picture plane. So if you're going to be working in this kind of style, then you need to learn about all of these various concepts that are part of that kind of more shallow, flat-like space painting. And these are concepts that Cezanne used in his paintings. So this flat static planes is very important in this kind of more shallow space painting, because these static planes, they have height and they have width, and therefore they connect up with the picture plane, which is this two-dimensional surface on which you're doing your painting. And because those planes are parallel to the picture plane, they flatten out the space more. But then you also are going to be working with dynamic planes. So it's both the static planes in opposition to the dynamic planes that you're going to be working with. So a dynamic plane has height and width, but it also has depth. It's going into space. And therefore it has diagonals as part of their axis. And then in the forms that you establish, you're going to apply distortion. So therefore, they don't adhere perfectly to perfect linear perspective. So in many cases, this kind of distortion is applied in order to flatten out the space more, so that those forms appear closer to the picture plane. So therefore, you might add static planes to those forms. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of distortion that can be applied to this more shallow, flat-like style of painting. Here you see a page from the textbook from the Famous Artist School's painting course. And here they talk about the two-dimensional surface that is part of this more flat-like style of painting. I'm going to enlarge this and read it. So it says, the two-dimensional surface. At no stage of the Cubist development did Picasso and Braque intend their forms to seem actually flat, like those of a wallpaper design. Both artists had been too thoroughly trained in conceiving forms in volume to be satisfied with a merely decorative arrangement in a picture. Their innovations were directed instead to finding equivalents on the flat surface for forms felt as three-dimensional. The process was one of constantly pushing up into the space of the picture the card-like planes, although some diagonal edges always remained. Leading back to the depth, they were invariably blocked by upright planes, which forced the eye back to the surface. The effect of this constant thrust and return action was to convey a sensation of tugs at the surface, coming simultaneously from different directions. So in this style of painting, what you see here is not applied. What you see there is the use of linear perspective and creating deep space rather than shallow space. So in this drawing here, done by one of the instructors at the Famous Artist Schools, you can see the use of perspective, linear perspective. So the lines of the buildings, you see, are going back toward a vanishing point on the horizon, which is right there. So all these edges of these forms are going back to that vanishing point. and back here as well, like that. So this is one-point perspective. And this creates a feeling of depth and deep space because your eye is going way back into the distance. But that's not the kind of space that Picasso or Braque wanted to create. They wanted to create a space that was more like the space that Cézanne created, which is a more shallow space, in order to bring everything forward toward the picture plane. So all of these forms here, they're not brought forward toward the picture plane. They're going away from the picture plane into the distance like that. And this results in a more realistic style of painting. But Picasso and Braque and Cézanne and others were not interested in realism. So what they did with forms like this, they distorted them. And here you can see the distortion. For example, with this building. The building has been distorted. And you see the distortion right here in this example. So how is it distorted? Well, instead of making the building appear smaller as it's moving back toward that vanishing point, what the artist does here is he makes the distant part of the building, which is that, larger instead of smaller. And the foreground here appears smaller than the back of the building. So what he's doing is he's increasing the width of the building in the background while decreasing the width of the building in the foreground. So it's a kind of reversal of perspective. And the artist does that because by doing that, the building appears closer to the picture plane. It seems to come closer instead of moving away from the picture plane, which of course is this, the two-dimensional surface on which this drawing has been done. And the same sort of distortion occurs with that form there. The back of this cube seems to be expanding, widening, instead of narrowing. So, are there other distortions? Yes, there are other distortions, and another one can be seen here where this tower is. So right now, as you know, that's the horizon. So when the horizon is down like that, you can't see the top of this tower because you're looking up at the tower from that horizon. Therefore, what needs to be done, which this artist did on the tower that he drew here, he is showing you the top of the tower. But if the horizon is down here, you can't see the top of the tower like I explained over here. So a distortion is made by tipping the top of the tower so that you can see the top of the tower. That's one viewpoint. So here's a little eye. You're looking down on top of that tower. But this part of the tower, you're seeing from a lower viewpoint. So that part of the tower, you're seeing from this viewpoint here, where the horizon is. So there are two different eye levels, in other words. And this is something that Cézanne did in a lot of his paintings. He would have multiple eye levels for just one object that he painted. So by showing the top of the tower, the artist is flattening out the space because now the top of that tower comes forward more toward the picture plane. Another thing that I want to point out is that in this drawing here, these objects have volume and form. They have dimension. They're not flat. So in this style of painting, you're still creating volume and form, not just a bunch of flat-looking shapes. And you'll see that in the paintings that I'm going to be showing you. Then there's also this concept, pushback space. You have shapes in the foreground that are light in tone, and then in back of them you have planes that are dark in tone, something like what you see there. And then the planes, which I already pointed out over here, they have an axis to them. As you can see there, they have height and width, so vertical and horizontal axis. And some of these planes can be distorted, like what you see there. So you end up with a more irregular shape, like that. Then the objects that you paint, they will have volume. and an access to that volume. But it's a more limited kind of volume. That is, not as much volume is shown as you would in a more realistic style. The style that you paint in using these concepts is not a realistic style. It doesn't give you a true representation of what the subject looks like. That's not its purpose. In this style, you're being more imaginative, not so literal as you would be in a more realistic style, as you'll see later in this video. What you also do is you apply both static and dynamic planes like you see here, and this kind of opposition of these planes also helps to create a certain amount of tension within the painting, and especially by how far or how close those planes are placed to each other. The further away the planes are from each other, the more tension there is. The closer they are, the less tension there is. Then also in this more semi-flat style of painting, in the composition, you establish movement into depth and then returning like that. And this establishes a balance of direction. So when you have something moving into the painting, you need something that's moving in the opposite direction. Thereby, a balance of direction is established. In addition, there is this reversal of diminishing sizes. So what that means is that shapes that are further back are made larger in size instead of smaller. And as they come forward toward the picture plane, they get smaller. And you can see Cezanne doing this in his paintings. And because he reverses perspective, he brings everything closer to the picture plane, and thereby he makes the space in which these shapes and forms exist more shallow. Brings everything closer to the viewer of the painting. And thereby the viewer has a more intimate experience of the subject that he or she is seeing in the painting. In addition, to flatten out the space more, vertical brushstrokes, like what you see there, like this, are used, instead of brushstrokes at an angle like that, which would suggest space. But the idea is to flatten out the space more, and therefore vertical brushstrokes are used instead of diagonals. Then there is this, the picture plane, which I already talked about when I pointed out the plane over here. So the picture plane has height and width. It is a flat shape. It has no depth. The picture plane is the plane upon which you do your painting. Also in this kind of more flat-like style of painting, aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective is reversed. Objects that are further back might look warmer than objects that are in the foreground, which is the reverse of what you would usually do in aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective, where the warmer colors are in the foreground and the cooler ones are further back. But by reversing atmospheric perspective, you flatten out the space more, because you're bringing what's in the distance forward more toward the picture plane. In addition, in this kind of more flat-like style, what you do is you eliminate or you limit the amount of chiaroscuro, which is light and shadow falling on a form in order to give volume and solidity to that form. So you can still have form and you can still have light and shadow, but you minimize it. You don't make it as strong as you would in a more realistic interpretation of the subject or form. And thereby, what happens is that, again, you flatten out the space more. But what you have to understand is that in this kind of painting, you are combining the flat with a sense or feeling of depth, of space, but a limited space. So both flatness and space exist within this kind of style of painting. So you might wonder, well, how could that be possible? Well, depth, for example, is achieved by way of overlapping of planes, like you see there. And since these planes are parallel to the picture plane, they appear more flat, but at the same time, they also give a sense or feeling of depth because of this overlapping that occurs. If you understand these concepts and are able to apply them, you'll be able to paint in the kind of style that you're going to see in this video. And it's a style in which design and abstraction and distortion becomes very important. However, what you'll also see is that the artist may also still apply a certain amount of linear perspective in order to have the subject that he or she is painting look more correct and have some form to them so that they don't look completely flat. For hundreds of years, deep space and linear perspective dominated the art world. And it wasn't until the 19th century that artists such as Van Gogh, Gauguin, Vollard, Monet, Matisse, Cezanne, of course, Picasso, did away with this kind of deep space, perfect perspective idea of drawing and painting that constituted what was thought to be good drawing and good painting. If you didn't apply this perfect linear perspective, then your drawings were not considered good. And there was no alternative to using this kind of geometric perfect perspective until the 19th century, in which all of that changed because of the artists that I mentioned. And in their work, you can see all sorts of distortions, and therefore they didn't adhere to this kind of more perfect linear perspective. And a different way of presenting the subject, a different way of painting, emerged, like what I'm going to be showing you in this video. This is an example of deep space perspective. Here you see the perspective lines going way back into the distance to a vanishing point on the horizon. In this video, I'm going to be showing you paintings that were done not in deep space, but rather this video is mostly about creating what is called shallow space. And what you see here, this box, is shallow space. Artists use shallow space because they want to bring all the shapes and forms closer to the picture plane, which is the two-dimensional surface on which they work. They don't want the eye to go way back in the distance and get lost there and not return to the picture plane. In other words, they want a more flat look to their painting, but yet create some depth so that the painting doesn't look like flat wallpaper designs. So what does the artist do if he or she is not using scientific or linear perspective in order to get some depth into the painting? Well, I'm going to point out the various concepts that these artists use to add some depth into the painting within this more shallow space that I've been talking about. So since there is some space within that box, a certain amount of depth can be created in the painting. So various concepts are used to create a feeling of depth. And one of them I already pointed out, which is this overlapping. That creates depth. So overlap your planes. Then another one is light-dark tones. So dark tone in the foreground, lighter tone further back, creates a feeling of depth. And dynamic planes, which I already pointed out. Dynamic planes have diagonals like that, which go into depth. So when you have a diagonal like that, that suggests or implies that there is some depth. And of course, size contrast, large size in the foreground and smaller size further back will create a feeling of depth. So to speed things up, I added some more concepts that help to create a feeling of depth in the painting. You can place dark tone like this, a really dark tone in back of a really light tone like that, and that dark tone will appear as though it's pushing back into space. Then place warm colors in the foreground, cooler ones in the distance, helps to create a feeling of depth. And then another concept here, which is texture. You place very little texture in the distance, almost no texture, and then you place texture in the foreground, and that helps to create a feeling of depth. So these are the concepts that the artists use that paint in this semi-abstract style to create some depth in their paintings, even though they're not using scientific or linear perspective, where perspective lines are going way back into the distance toward a vanishing point on the horizon. So if you want to use this more flat approach with a more compressed space, you start out like this, for example, and I'm just going to do a quick rough sketch. It's not a finished painting. So keep Cezanne's more narrow space in mind, like that, instead of what I showed you with that Renaissance perspective. Then, thinking of a more compressed space, I'll begin by just quickly roughing in the subject, and I'm thinking of planes. Remember, the static plane and the dynamic planes. And you play them one against the other. So, let's say there's this dock where boats are moored, and on that dock there's a fisherman's hut, like this, and already I'm thinking in terms of static planes. This is the dock, and it's a static plane. It has height and it has width. But I'm avoiding depth because I want this to be a more shallow space, a more flattened space. So therefore, I wouldn't do something like this where I have a vanishing point and a horizon, and then I have the perspective lines of the dock like this going back to that vanishing point. This would create too much depth, and it wouldn't flatten out the space. So I wouldn't end up with a more flat approach to painting. This would be more conducive to the more Renaissance style of painting, where aerial perspective and linear perspective are applied. But I don't want that here. So therefore, I'm establishing a flat plane here, which is parallel to this, the picture plane, like I explained earlier, with this box here. And then there's a mountain back here, and that plane of the mountain is also a static plane. It has height and width. Then there's the water located here, and that water also has a static plane to it like this. Again, it has height and width, but there's no depth. There's no dynamic plane like that. So all these planes that are parallel to the picture plane flatten out the space more. So let me continue here. I'm doing this in real time, really rough, like this. This is not intended to be a finished painting, like I said. Then I'm tipping the building. That's one of the concepts of Cézanne, where he tips objects. And I'm tipping this hut that's located on the dock here, and then I'll place some boats down here, 3 boats, and then the posts for the dock, holding up the dock. So really rough, like this. Then I'm going to repeat this pattern of these posts, this vertical linear pattern. I'm going to repeat that over here on a fence, like that. And I'll even repeat it on the floorboards of this dock. And you'll notice that these floorboards are vertical. They're not diagonal. They're not going back into space toward a vanishing point. That would give me too much space, and it wouldn't flatten out the painting like what I want. I want a more flat-looking painting. However, within this more flat-looking painting, there's still going to be form. Remember, I talked about that. Once you have your sketch, you add a toner, like what I'm doing now, over the sketch. So I'm using the red because I want the colors that I'm going to be placing over this toner to contrast with this red color. So I'm going to be adding the blue of the water against this red toner, which helps to create more interesting looking color, and some vibrancy of color can be achieved that way when you play 2 different hues against each other. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole painting process. If you want to know what the painting process is, then check out a video that I made based on what the famous artist school taught when it comes to a painting process. Now, I may still have that video at my YouTube channel. You might want to check that out. And that video goes into that process in depth. So it's not like some of these art instruction videos where the artist rushes through the painting process
And you really can't learn anything that way. Or if the artist takes a lot of time and just fiddles around on one part of the painting and gives you a few tips here and there, you can't learn to paint that way. You might think you're learning something, but you're really not learning anything if you're watching videos like that. You have to have the interest and patience to want to really learn what the painting process is in detail. It's the only way you're going to really learn the painting process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue working on this, and I'm going to carry it to a much further state in which I've added the colors and the value pattern and all those other various things that go into the making of a painting, but it's still just going to be a rough color sketch because doing a finished painting would take too long. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like. And as you can see, I flipped the painting so the dock is on the left side instead of on the right side, which I started out with. And you see, I kept that idea of a static plane. This here makes a rectangle shape that has height and width, and is a static plane that locks to this, which is the picture plane. So I'm flattening out the space more because of that. It's a more shallow space because the eye stops right there where the mountain is. It doesn't continue much further back into space, which it would if I applied aerial perspective with additional mountains in back of that mountain going further back into space. But I don't want that. I want a more shallow space, like I've been pointing out, like what I showed with this box. Now, while I flattened out the space more here, it's not completely flat. There's still depth here, and there's still solid forms as well. Like, for example, where the hut is. There's light and shadow on that hut, creating a feeling of a three-dimensional form. Also, the fact that I have these boats here that are overlapping and going back into space creates a feeling of space as well. And, of course, the small sailboat back here, in contrast with the larger forms in the foreground, creates a feeling of space. However, where the water is, like I explained earlier, that water makes a static plane. It has height and it has width, and it links up or locks to the picture plane, thereby flattening out the space more. So the color that I added down here is the same color of blue that I add up there further back. And because the blue is the same at the bottom as it is at the top, it flattens out the space. So I'm not applying atmospheric perspective to the water in order to flatten out the space more. And also, the mountain looks more flat, and therefore it comes forward, because it too is a plane, like I explained earlier, that has height and width, but no depth. And here at the edge of the dock, you can see that there is a vertical there, not a diagonal. If I added a diagonal like this, then that would create too much space. Diagonals go back into space. They establish a feeling of space. But I don't want that. I want a more flat look like that. Now, this concept here, the open color and value pattern, is what I applied. I'm going to turn it into a black and white. The connection here between the apples and this dark shape here. So when you look at my mountain over here, and you look at the shadow on the hut, you can see those values are the same, or very similar, and therefore they connect with each other, creating this open pattern. Pattern being very important in this kind of painting. So all of this is a dark value pattern, and it comes around like that into the shadow of the hut, and then into the cast shadow, coming around like this, and around like that, and down and around like that. Now, what I also need to do here is darken all of this more, so that it becomes more part of that darker value pattern. Remember, this is not a finished painting. There are still things that would need to be done if I was going to turn this into a finished painting. I'm going to darken that lower section by using levels, so something like that maybe. And that balances the darks at the upper part of the picture better. Something like that maybe. See what it looks like in color. And looking at the mountain, I see that that mountain also needs to be darkened a bit. something like this. That's better. And it makes those warm colors really pop. Those lighter values of those warm colors. And see how flat that mountain is kept in order to bring it forward more. And I think a couple of seagulls could be added over here like this. Adds more interest to this space. And the focal point is right there. As I'm looking at the painting, I realized that I should have kept the hut on the right side. I had it correct to begin with. So you see, you don't always make the right decision immediately. Later, when you look at the painting, you may discover that, well, what I did initially was better than what I'm doing now. So, therefore, the whole process of painting involves making lots of changes. So you're not going to put down something that's perfect right away and you continue to paint and there are no changes made, and that doesn't work. That's not the way a painting comes into existence. You have to dive right into doing the painting. In the beginning, you're putting down the big, simple shapes, and you're being more bold in the way you establish those shapes. You don't carefully paint in the shapes. As the painting progresses, you slowly begin to tighten it up more, but you don't try to overwork it. And only in the very last stages do you add detail. But in the beginning, it's just the big, bold shapes of value and color that you put down. So I'm going to flip the painting. And I think that works better. Why? Well, because you don't immediately see the center of interest, which of course is the hut. You enter the painting down here. Usually that's where the eye enters a painting, but not always. The eye could actually enter at any part of the painting, but usually the eye tends to enter at the bottom. So the eye doesn't immediately see the center of interest. It's attracted to the boats here, and the boats point in, lead the eye in, then the posts point up toward the center of interest here. So there's that compositional movement that takes place, and usually placing the center of interest on the right side as opposed to the left side usually works better. And that's also because we tend to read from left to right, not from right to left. So if you place the center of interest over on the right side, the viewer doesn't immediately see the center of interest. The viewer has to travel over toward the right where the center of interest is established. But of course, this rule can be broken just like every other rule can be broken, if you have a good reason for breaking the rule. Now, when it comes to color, the warm colors tend to come forward, while the cool colors tend to go back. So there's this push-pull, as it's called. Cool colors push back, warm colors pull forward. And this creates a tension. The line of the edge of the mountain is a little too straight, so I'm going to add some variation into those straight lines by adding some little bumps here and there, like that, just to get rid of any lines that look too straight. Since everything else in the painting is not straight, doesn't have perfect straight lines, the edge of that mountain also should not have perfectly straight lines. Then the straight line here needs to be broken up a little bit, maybe something like this. And I think I'm going to add a slight suggestion of that yellow-orange and orange color into the mountain back there to tie the mountain to the warm yellow-orange color on the hut and the dock. And I could even add a bit of the blue to the mountain, just a little bit here and there, just a suggestion of the blue, just to repeat some colors in the mountain that appear in other parts of the painting. That helps to tie everything together better through color, but not too much, because I do want to keep that mountain shape more flat and abstract looking. And I think I add a little of that yellow-orange and orange color to the water here, just a little bit more saturated, something like that. That adds more interest to the color. Then where the spacing is, where the posts are, I need to add a space that's a bit wider. So there needs to be more variety in the spacing or the intervals between the posts. Something like that. So I have more narrow intervals and wider intervals. And that variety of intervals of spacing adds interest. As I continue to look at this little rough sketch, I can see that the shape of the building isn't interesting enough. So what do you do in a case like that? Well, what you could do is you add a smaller form to that building, like what I'm going to do now, like that. And then I have these small dark barrels here that contrast with the larger dark shadow shape, and that adds a lot of interest. So now the overall shape is more interesting. There's also this contrast of a smaller form with a bigger form. That adds interest. Artists are visual entertainers. You need to learn how to make the painting visually interesting, how to entertain people looking at your paintings. What's going to interest them? I think that's about as far as I'm going to take this rough color sketch. So if this more flat kind of style of painting appeals to you, then what you need to do is to learn these various concepts that I pointed out and start applying them to your paintings. Now, there are a few more concepts that Cezanne uses, but there's no time for me to go into that. But I have pointed out quite a few of them, so that should be enough for you to be able to start painting in this more flat style, if that's the style that you want to start painting in, rather than the more realistic style.
And here are a couple examples of this more flat style of painting. The Japanese print over here, that consists of completely flat shapes. No form whatsoever in terms of modeling with various tones to create a feeling of form. While the example on the right here, which was done by one of my favorite illustrators, Robert Baxter, who used to work at the famous artist school. This style, as you can see, is more abstract, is using these abstract shapes, and it has a more flat look, but it's not completely flat like the example on the left with the Japanese print. That is completely flat, while the one on the right is not completely flat, within which these characters exist. While the example on the left doesn't give you any feeling of space in which she exists, because everything's flat. The space on the right, that is shallow space or limited space. It's not deep space. The eye's not going way back into the distance. Even here, where the open window is and you see the clouds, you don't get a feeling of great distance. It looks closer. Everything is brought closer to the picture plane. And because of that, everything is flattened out more, but not entirely, like I said. So why is this not an entirely flat painting? Well, because Baxter introduces tonal variation within the shapes. So here, for example, this shape, you can see that there are lighter darks and darker darks. I'm going to turn this into a black and white, and you can see the tonal variations, the changes in tone. Some lighter tone, some darker tone. And this variation in tones is called modeling, where you use variations in tone to create a feeling of form or an appearance of form. And so, therefore, because of this modeling, the shapes do not look completely flat like they do in the Japanese print. In this kind of limited space or shallow space painting, various spatial concepts are used to bring everything closer to the picture plane, which are these spatial concepts that you see here. In this kind of more flat style, the artist is more concerned with establishing the tonal relationships of what the local values of the subject are, rather than applying light and shadow to create a feeling of form, that is, give the subject a more three-dimensional appearance. so that the subject looks like it has form, has a sculptural look to it. You can see here the different values of the local values of the various parts of this painting. So you see the black here, then you see a lighter tone right there, and a bit darker tone here, and a lighter tone in the background, and a light tone right there. Those are the local values that the artist is concerned with in this style, and what their relationships are to each other. That is this one dark, or is that tone a little lighter than that one? Or maybe this tone is even lighter than this tone, or that tone is lighter than that. So it's what the relationships of the various tones or local values are like that the artist is concerned with, and not the depiction of form, which is three-dimensional, and in this style, it's more of a flat style compared to the style that results from applying light and shadow. And when you use light and shadow to create form, you are applying what is called chiaroscuro. See right there? Chiaroscuro. That's what using light and shadow to create form with is called. I'm going to make a copy of this print, and I'm going to apply chiaroscuro to the copy here. So you have to establish the light source. Let's say it's the sun shining from top left. Part of her face is going to be in shadow. I'm doing this really quick, so it's not going to be perfect. Not interested in making a perfect painting here. Then there's a shadow falling on her kimono. All of this, let's say, is in shadow. And down here, like that. And her headdress is in shadow. So now I have two different styles here. One in which form becomes dominant. The other one in which the local values or masses of tone are dominant and more flat. So you could say I have flat and I have form. Two different styles. Neither one is better than the other. They're just different styles. You may prefer to work more with form, or you may prefer to work in a more flat style. That's up to you. But what's important to note is that one style must dominate. You can have both styles within the same painting, but one must dominate over the other. Now, you might be thinking, well, what does he mean by dominant in this case? Well, what I'm talking about is that there needs to be more of one style than the other. And when there is more of one style than the other, that style then becomes the dominant style. And to make this really clear, I'm going to take her face and bring it over to the flat style. So I'm bringing over the form to the flat style. And now, in this example, you see that there is more of the flat style than there is of the form style. So therefore, the flat style becomes dominant over the form style. So why have one style dominant? Well, it's done because if you don't have one style that is dominant, and you combine two different styles that are equal in amount, then it becomes very confusing for the viewer to make any sense of what they are looking at. Is this a flat style? Is this a form style? What is going on? And it gets very confusing. So therefore, one style must dominate over the other. Like what you can see in this wonderfully done illustration by the great illustrator Al Parker, who was one of the guiding faculty members for the famous artist school. He's combining two different styles here, the flat style with the form style. And the form, of course, is found on the head and hands of this woman and on the head of the man here. While the rest of the painting, background, parts of her figure, the arm here and here and here, as well as the shirt and this part of the illustration and here, those are all more flat shapes compared to the faces. And you can see that he's applying this principle of dominance of style because most of the painting consists of a more flat style compared to lesser amounts used for form. But the form in the faces, for example, is more subtle. It's not created with strong light and shadow. like with chiaroscuro, if he had applied that. He's applying modeling, which refers to variations in tone in order to create a feeling or appearance of form, but the form is more subtle here. It's not a more sculptural, voluminous, three-dimensional form. It's more subtle. If he had done something like this, applying strong light and shadow, that would have been too much. The forms would have started looking too sculptural. And on the man's face, shadow like that. This doesn't work as well as when he keeps the modeling more subtle like this. And the forms look a bit more flat. So you see, this combining of different styles can be done if it's done in the right way. And you can see that the more flat style is what dominates over the form style. There's more flatness here than there is form. And where you do see the form is kept more subtle and not too sculptural looking. Parker uses a shallow space or limited space in which these shapes and forms exist. It's not deep space. He flattens out the space more because he's using a lot of flat shapes. There's no need for any deep space. There's enough space here in which these shapes and forms can exist. And there is a feeling of space or depth or distance because she's larger in the foreground and he's smaller back here, creating a feeling of depth. And the result is a feeling of space in which these characters exist. In this Robert Baxter painting, Baxter uses a more abstract and more flat style, but it's not completely flat. Because when you look at the figure here, you can see that there are tonal variations within the figure. And in this black and white, you can see those tonal variations. And by adding tonal variations, he is modeling the forms. When you use modeling, you are introducing different tones to give some form to the shapes. Some shapes have more form than others. Like, for example, the figure here in the foreground has more form than the man that is back here. You can see on his shape of the sweater that he's wearing that shape looks more flat compared to her shapes, which have more form. The rest of the painting, the wall back here and the floor and that wall, they look more flat compared to the woman. So although Baxter is concerned more with design and abstraction and a more flat approach, he's still introducing some form within the various objects. But most of them are more flat compared to the woman. So here you see an example of the more abstract and flat approach being dominant over form. But form is still part of the painting. I think this is such a wonderful and well done painting. And what you see here is typical of the style that Robert Baxter works in. When it comes to the kind of space that Baxter is using in his painting, it's a more limited or shallow space, and he brings everything, therefore, closer to the picture plane. He doesn't want the eye of the viewer to go way back into the distance. He wants the eye of the viewer to stay in the foreground more, so therefore the space is made more shallow, which brings everything closer to the picture plane. And this kind of more shallow or limited space is the kind of space that is used in this style of painting in which more abstract and more flat-like shapes and forms are used. Many of these spatial concepts for more shallow or limited space painting can be traced back to Cezanne. And here you see a book that was put together by Earl Loren, and it's all about Cezanne's composition, in which he points out many of these spatial concepts. This is no doubt a great book on Cezanne's composition. When I first got this book, I couldn't put it down. I was fascinated by what Earl Loren was discovering about Cezanne's paintings, how he used composition and space. Absolutely fascinating. No wonder Cézanne is considered the father of modern art. Another book in which these spatial concepts can be found is this one, Watercolor Energies by Frank Webb, one of the great watercolorists. And he too uses these spatial concepts to compress space and to work within a more shallow space rather than deep space. And I'll be showing you some examples of his paintings in this video in which he uses some of these spatial concepts. This painting was done by Paul Cézanne, and this page is from that book, Cézanne's Composition. Many of these spatial concepts that I pointed out can be found in Cézanne's paintings. He uses them because he puts his shapes and forms into a more shallow space. He brings everything closer to the picture plane, which is what these spatial concepts allow him to do, such as, for example, this spatial concept of reversal of diminishing sizes, where he places the larger shapes and forms in the background instead of in the foreground, which is what you can see here with this building, which is larger in size in the background here than these buildings in the foreground. So this is a reversal of perspective, because in order to create a greater feeling of depth, you put the larger shapes and forms in the foreground and then the smaller ones further back. But if he did that, then the space would no longer be as shallow as it is now, and that would then not bring everything forward and closer to the picture plane, which is what he wanted to do. Just like what I showed you Robert Baxter doing in his painting. Also, one of the other spatial concepts that are used in this sort of more shallow or limited space painting is distortion. So where is distortion in his painting? Well, what he's doing here is he's tipping the building and these buildings. They're at an angle. So he's tipping them over toward the left. And that is a form of distortion. And Cézanne was not interested in deep space. He didn't want the eye to go way back into the distance and get stuck there. And because of that, he brought everything forward, closer to the picture plane. And he did that using these spatial concepts, and which many other artists after him used in their own paintings, in which these artists also wanted to create a more shallow space and bring everything closer to the picture plane. And it is these concepts that can be found in Frank Webb's great watercolor paintings. And he even talks about them in his book. And he shows you how he uses them in his paintings. And in this video, I'm going to give you a few examples of how he uses them. This kind of more flat style, as it can be called, is very popular with many artists. It offers them an alternative to deep space perspective and allows the artist to express himself with a greater amount of freedom and creativity, because he is not limited and bound by a lot of deep space perspective rules that need to be adhered to get a more accurate representation of the subject. These artists are not interested in giving a more realistic or representational interpretation of the subject. In other words, they're not interested in duplicating reality. They're interested in creating their own kind of reality in their paintings. In this diagram here, which has also been taken from the book Cézanne's Composition, you can see that Cézanne is making that space more shallow, like I showed you earlier with that box that I created. So he's placing these shapes and forms within this more limited space and bringing all of these shapes and forms closer to the picture plane, which is, of course, this two-dimensional surface on which the artist works and tries to create the illusion of some space. And to bring everything closer to the picture plane, Cézanne turns this wall here, which is a dynamic plane, toward the front. You see that right here. that plane is seen from the front here. Thereby, it becomes parallel with the picture plane and unites with the picture plane, and because of that, it unifies with the picture plane. And this plane of the building here is also a two-dimensional plane, as well as the hill back here. See that hill right there? All of these planes are facing the picture plane, and therefore they unite with the picture plane, and the result is a more unified painting, because these planes are all unified, uniting with the picture plane. So that's the idea that Cézanne had in mind when he compressed space like this. He turned this dynamic plane into a more static plane here, so that it would unite with the picture plane. And up here, as you can see, is the photograph of the scene that Cézanne painted. And he actually was out there painting this building and wall. This is about where he stood when he did his painting. This painting is considered to be one of Cézanne's greatest paintings, largely because it embodies so many of these spatial concepts that I'm pointing out to you in this video, and which can be traced back to Cézanne. Let me point out another great concept of his, which is what I'm going to be showing you now. It's this extraordinary concept of multiple viewpoints or eye levels within a painting, like you can see here in this diagram. The different objects are seen at different eye levels. Take, for example, the basket that you see here and over here in the painting. That basket is seen from a high eye level right there, looking at the top of the basket. Then when you look at the handle of the basket over here, that is actually being seen from the right side and at that eye level, while the front of the basket over here is seen from a different viewpoint, which is here and lower down. The basket, therefore, is actually being seen from three different viewpoints. When looking at the handle over here, from this viewpoint and eye level, the handle would be seen more in perspective, like this. It wouldn't be made wider like what you see here. Cézanne made it wider because that brings it closer to the picture plane. It helps to flatten out the space more. Matter of fact, the whole painting is put into a more shallow space, just like the building that I showed you earlier, this one here, where the amount of space has been reduced to a more shallow space. When you look at this ginger jar over here, and you look at the picture over here, they're seen from different eye levels. And you can see that over here in the diagram. So you see the ginger jar being seen from above, looking down on the ginger jar opening right there. And then the picture is seen from this eye level, and therefore the top of the ginger jar where the opening is more of a circle, while the lid of this picture here is more of an oval because it is seen at a different eye level. Why does Cézanne make the opening here for the ginger jar more of a circle? Well, he does that because that brings the ginger jar closer to the picture plane. The sugar bowl that you see over here, that is seen at the same eye level as the picture over here, and you can see that in the diagram right there. You see, they're both being seen from the same eye level, but the ginger jar isn't. It's seen from above. Showing objects at different eye levels creates tension in the painting. To further create tension, he tips the picture here like that, and the sugar bowl. So they're at an angle. He tips them over a bit, just like what Sterling Edwards did with his painting of the buildings. More tension is created by breaking the edge of the table here, which you see over here in the diagram. The break occurs right here. So if I, let's say, extend the edge of the table line like this, you see it doesn't line up with the other side of the table edge. So there's distortion going on here, which further adds to the tension in the painting. All these objects are made large like this, placed in the foreground, because that puts them closer to the picture plane. Cezanne wants a more shallow space, and he wants everything to come more forward toward the picture plane, closer to the picture plane, thereby creating a more shallow space. In other words, he's interested in flattening out the space more by bringing everything closer to the picture plane. The tabletop is flattened out somewhat because the perspective lines of the edge of the table, like you see here, don't recede back to a vanishing point. They're not converging, in other words, toward a vanishing point. So the tabletop doesn't have the kind of perspective that would result if those perspective lines at the edge of the table were converging toward a vanishing point on the horizon, which would look something like this. You see now, the tabletop here looks more like it is going into depth, into space. The shape no longer looks as flat as it does without those perspective lines going back toward a vanishing point. So here, the tabletop shape looks more flat, while here, it looks more like it has some depth to it. It's going back into space. But by making the tabletop more flat like that, he brings it closer to the picture plane. So in this painting, you see Cezanne using this spatial concept of distortion, which is what you also see in Frank Webb's paintings and Sterling Edwards' paintings, as well as other artists' paintings that use these kind of spatial concepts in their work. Seeing an object like this basket here from multiple viewpoints actually gives you a more complete description of what the object is like than if you just used one viewpoint, like in scientific perspective. And seeing an object from multiple viewpoints also gives that object a greater feeling of a three-dimensional object. So all these spatial concepts can be traced back to Cezanne.
This idea of a more compressed or more shallow space is applied by modern-day painters who use this approach to painting, such as, for example, what I'm going to show you now. This painting was done by the great Frank Webb, and what a magnificent, brilliant watercolor painter he is.
And these little rough sketches that you see here that I did, I'm showing some of the spatial concepts of Cezanne. So, of course, he didn't use scientific perspective, which is shown here by these diagonals going back into the distance to a horizon and a vanishing point. So he didn't do that. And what he did was those forms that are further back in space, like this building here, he would bring that forward, like you see here, and make it large in size. So what is in the distance, he brought forward in order to bring it closer to the picture plane. And those objects that were large in the foreground, he made small, like this. So what was in the distance, he enlarged. What was in the foreground enlarged, he made smaller. So he ended up with something like that, in order to compress the space more, to bring what is in the distance forward toward the picture plane, to get closer to the picture plane, and thereby he compressed the space. And in this diagram, I'm just pointing out what you would see when you're looking at some pots. From this viewpoint here, you would see ovals for the openings of the pots. But then what I'm showing down here is this idea of multiple viewpoints that I just talked about. So in this example, right here, there are two viewpoints. And I did the same over here, but as you can see, I cropped out part of the drawing. So this drawing was made a bit more accurate than this. So let me fix this drawing up more. Here you can see two different viewpoints. One viewpoint is looking at the pot straight on, like that. But then there's another viewpoint where you're further up, looking down on the pot, and therefore you see the circle of the opening. And not an ellipse like you would over here in normal perspective or normal viewing of the pots from just one vantage point or viewpoint. So by doing this, Cezanne compressed the space more or flattened it out more. he brought everything closer to the picture plane, like I talked about over here. And this is what Frank Webb does over here in his watercolor painting. He enlarges the forms and shapes that are further back, and then he makes the forms and shapes smaller that are in the foreground, like that.
Here's another painting he did. In this painting, he uses this concept here. The large shape in back of the smaller shape, the boat over here. So the boat is smaller than that ship back there, thereby bringing the background forward more, compressing the space more, in other words. But there's still a feeling of some depth because of this shape and then that horizon line back there in the distance. So there's still a feeling of depth.
And now, coming up next, I'm going to show you how a well-known painter uses rhythm in painting a picture of a town. And what becomes important is design, because rhythm is part of design. When you apply rhythm, you're applying design to a painting. And if you don't know the principles of design and how to apply them to your paintings, then you're never going to be able to paint in this more semi-abstract style that I've been showing you that these great artists paint in. Because as I've pointed out, what becomes most important in that kind of semi-abstract style is design. So you have to know what those principles of design are and how to apply them. And if you don't know them, then you can learn them through my complete illustration art course. You'll learn all the principles of design and how to apply them to your art. And then if you choose to paint in this more semi-abstract style, you'll know the principles that need to be applied. But of course, these principles are applied to no matter what style there is. But they are especially important in this more semi-abstract style that I've been showing you throughout the video. And as you'll see, this artist paints in that more flat style, with more compressed space.
This artist is William Vaughan. And let me show you his painting, in which there is lots of rhythm. Now, if you went to an expensive brick-and-mortar art school, you spent a fortune, you should, of course, be able to spot the rhythm here. There are all kinds of different rhythms here. But the foremost rhythm is shape rhythm. And you can see that shape rhythm throughout the entire composition. So what is the shape that makes a rhythm here? Well, it is, you see this? A long rectangle. And that long, narrow rectangle is repeated throughout the composition. You can find it everywhere. And there are wider rectangles. This is where variation comes in. You see, that rectangle, of course, is wider than these. And the fact that they are repeated and varied in size and width, like this rectangle here is smaller than that one, makes a rhythm. And then he also varies that rectangle, so he has a big square shape here, you see? And then he breaks up that big square shape with smaller rectangular shapes, like this. They're all over, different sizes. And right here, this is more of an organic shape, like that. And then, of course, here's a rectangle shape, another one over here and here. Then he introduces a different shape for some variety. And then among all of these rectangle shapes, which of course are made up of straight lines, he introduces a curved shape. And you see that right over here. See that dome? Let me show that like this. So you can see this large curve, and then there are smaller curves here, and then there's a small curve here, a circle here, and over here. Even these small shapes have small curves that need to be taken into account. But there are very few of these curves that are introduced into all of these straight line rectangle shapes. And that helps to provide relief to all of those rectangular shapes. Now, there's so much going on in terms of rhythm that I can't point out everything. It would just take too long. But you can carefully study this yourself and spot all of the rhythms here, all of the rectangular and square shapes that are being created to form this overall rhythmic composition. Beautifully done. Now, this is so simple to do, but yet students fail to do this. All you have to do in this case is just repeat a rectangle like that with different sizes, different widths, like that, just again and again, and then you break those up into smaller rectangles, and then you can add squares like that, square down here, and just repeat that again and again, just like what he did, and you establish a rhythm of rectangular shapes. So simple. But students, they start introducing all sorts of different shapes, and things get too complicated, then there is no rhythm, and they end up with a bad picture. Try something like this. Keep it simple. And then you introduce curving shape, like what William Cezanne did over here. And just a couple of those curving shapes, and maybe a circle like what he did, just to give some relief to all of those rectangular shapes. And already, with this, it's beginning to look rather interesting. And I did this in a few seconds. And then I could add tone and color, and I have a little rough sketch. Then it has one of the requirements of a really good painting, rhythm. Just make sure that when you repeat the shape, you repeat it with variation. Remember that important principle that I am talking about in this video, repetition with variation. That's what will also create rhythm, aside from the variety that the painting needs to become really interesting looking. This is the kind of practice work you need to do. And when you do this, you're going to get better and better at applying rhythm, and it's going to look better and better. And then eventually you're going to be able to paint pictures like William Vaughan here that is very rhythmic and visually appealing. But first, you have to start simple, like that, just little rough thumbnail sketches, like what I'm showing you here, applying what you've learned in this video.
Let me give you a quick example here. So let's say I do something like this. And I add a horizon line up there like that. Vanishing point on the right side, vanishing point on the left side. And I'll add a perspective line like this. And another one to the other vanishing point. Make a vertical. Draw perspective line to the vanishing point on the right. And then one to the left. Something like this. Then I want to find the center right over here. And the way to do that is to make an X, draw a vertical through the intersection, coming up like that. Now I can add a roof like this. Top of the roof goes to the vanishing point on the right. So now I have this building. Then I'm going to add some distant mountains back there like this. So this is an example of using linear perspective or deep space perspective or scientific perspective, whatever you want to call it. It creates a feeling of deep space. The eye is going way back into the distance. This is deep space. Now, using these same elements over here, I'm going to apply them to a different kind of space, which is more shallow. So that means that I have to bring this mountain forward. Something like that. And then I'm going to add the building, but I'm going to distort it a little bit. Something like that. Now, this space here is no longer deep space because you can't go way back into the distance like you can in this example. So therefore, that space has been compressed. It is now a more limited or shallow space. And one of the spatial concepts in this style of painting using more shallow or limited space is distortion. Distortion can be applied to various objects. The artist may decide not to distort certain elements and maybe make some of these elements conform more to this kind of perspective, or the artist may ignore that kind of perspective. It all depends on what the artist wants to do. So therefore, even in a more shallow space and a more flat style in this kind of shallow space painting, you can still have form, such as what I'm going to do now by adding a shadow here, which helps to create a feeling of form. So I don't have to make this building completely flat. And you'll see examples of this application of form with light and shadow in the examples that I'm going to be showing you. So I can work within a limited space or shallow space and still create elements that have some form to them or feeling of form, in spite of making some elements more flat. Like the mountain here, I could increase the feeling of flatness by adding vertical strokes like this. When you apply vertical strokes, they don't suggest depth like diagonal strokes do. And you can see in many drawings that artists do that work in this kind of style, this more flat style, they apply these vertical strokes in order to keep everything more flat looking. But then some parts have a bit more form to them. The idea here in this kind of space is to bring everything toward the picture plane, which is this, the flat two-dimensional picture plane. And by bringing everything closer to the picture plane, you compress the space more, and it becomes more of a shallow space rather than deep space. If you decide to do a painting in which the space is more shallow like this, or more limited, you still need to be able to create a feeling of space, even though the shapes may appear more or less flat looking. And the way that is done is by the various spatial concepts that I'm going to be showing you in this video. So I'm dividing space into two categories, deep space painting, and then there's shallow space painting, or limited space as it's also called. I'm going to show you a painting done for a book cover in which deep space has been applied. And with deep space painting, you can get this more sculptural look created with light and shadow like you see here. And of course, you can see that there is a lot of depth here, going way back into the distance like that. And therefore, this is deep space painting. Whenever it looks like there's a lot of space where you can go pretty far back into the distance, then of course it's called deep space painting, which results from scientific perspective. Now I'm going to show you a book cover that was done with shallow space. And I think you can immediately see the difference between the two. In this painting, you don't see that kind of depth or distance. Everything looks more flat because the artist is more concerned here not with creating this kind of sculptural look like you see here, but rather with more flat shapes, like her hair, the man's tuxedo. These are all more flat shapes, and the table here. So what the artist is concerned with here is pattern, and pattern is basically flat. Flat shapes make pattern. That's how you usually think of pattern, in terms of flat shapes, like silhouette shapes. And that's what this artist is making here. He's making patterns, more flat-looking shapes. You may want to paint in this style, or you may want to paint in this style. That's totally up to you, whatever appeals to you most. Now, even though these shapes here exist within a more flat space, it's not completely flat. Why? Well, because there is still a sense of some depth here, and therefore it is a more shallow space. Here, everything is brought quite close to the picture plane, which is the two-dimensional surface on which the painting has been painted. Now, the reason why there is still a feeling of some depth is because of overlapping. The table is overlapping the woman, and the woman is overlapping the man. And this overlapping creates a feeling of depth. But of course, it's not a lot of depth, like the kind of depth that you see here. I'm going to be talking more about this overlapping to create a sense of depth within the painting later in the video. So this figure here has a sculptural look. That is, he appears three-dimensional and not more flat like here. And you don't get that feeling in this painting because the artist is not using light and shadow to create a feeling of a three-dimensional form. The artist is concerned with the local colors and values, rather than creating a feeling of light and shadow to create a more sculptural or three-dimensional form like you see here. The interesting thing to note here, however, even though the artist is painting in a more flat style, the shapes are not completely flat like graphic shapes. There are subtle tonal differences here, and you can see them in this black and white. think I'm going to enlarge this so you can get a better look at it. And you can see these subtle differences in tone in the hair, for example. Very subtle, very slight differences. And you can see differences in tone here. You see a lighter tone there and then a darker tone here. And on her arm here and here, very subtle differences. And here. See, if it were a graphic shape for her hair, it would look more like what I'm going to do now. Now it's completely flat. There is no tonal variation whatsoever. It's just one dark tone. That's it. But that's not what the artist does. He introduces subtle modeling like that. And that adds more interest to the shape than if he had a strictly graphic shape like that, without any tonal differences whatsoever. That is more boring. This is more interesting. Now, the artist who did this, by the way, his name is James Hill. You might want to take a look at his great illustrations on Google. I love this cover. I think it's so well done. It has such simplicity. And I love this cover just as much. Beautifully done, I think. The kind of covers that I seldom, if ever, see nowadays. These paperback book covers were done back in the 70s, I think. Styles, of course, have changed. So therefore, you don't see this style anymore, this more flat style. Or if you do see it, it's rare. Nowadays, photos are mostly used on book covers. Now here's another book cover, beautifully done, I think, and I think Robert McGinnis did this one of the great illustrators of all time. And unfortunately, you don't see his paintings on book covers anymore. There is, however, one publisher that does still use his style, but for the most part, his work is no longer seen as much as it used to be in the past, and that's really a shame. No photograph can do what you see here. He enhances reality in a way that a photograph just can't do. Photograph always looks rather pale and insipid compared to a painting like this. In this illustration, McGinnis is using deep space. You can see the eye going way back into the distance there. You get a great feeling of space in this illustration, and therefore this is deep space painting as opposed to shallow space painting. And here's another wonderful deep space painting. Again, like the others, I think this has been really well done. Superb example of a book cover. And like with the other deep space paintings, you get a feeling of great depth or distance. The eye goes way back into the distance there. So this is not shallow space. This is deep space. You have a choice. You can paint pictures that have deep space, a greater feeling of distance, or you can paint pictures that are painted within a more narrow or limited or shallow space, in which the forms then become less sculptural looking. The less space there is, the more flat the objects will look, because there's not enough space for them to exist in, so they need to be flattened out somewhat. Then you can have shallow space, in which there's more space, and that's when you can then add a bit more form, and you don't have to have the objects looking flat. Now here's an example of shallow space painting. This was done by Bob Baxter, one of my favorite illustrators. Now he does fine art. And here again, like in this cover, a more flat approach is being used. But these shapes are not entirely flat, because like with this cover, there are subtle tonal variations. So you don't get the feeling of completely flat shapes. In this black and white version, you can see subtle tonal differences right here, for example, on her dress. You see some lighter tones, some darker tones, but the overall tone is dark. And it appears more flat, but not completely flat because of these subtle tonal differences. Same thing over here for her vest. You see subtle tonal differences. Subtle tonal differences are important in order to create a feeling of a little bit of form. But those differences in tone need to be subtle, because if they aren't, then the shape will no longer look more flat. There has to be some hint of form, but not that much in this style, in this approach, where the artist is concerned with local color and local value rather than with light and shade. When it comes to this kind of style, in which light and shadow are used to create a greater feeling of form, or a more sculptural, three-dimensional look than what you see in this style here. In this style, it's the patterns of light and dark and midtone that are important. that are emphasized and not light and shadow. So when you compare this style to this one, you definitely see that here a more flat approach is being used, more flat looking shapes than what you see there. Now you might think, well, it's probably easier to paint in this style than in this one over here. Well, no. Nothing is easy in art, even though it might look rather easy. When you go and try to do it yourself, you discover just how difficult it is. It's difficult to get just the right degree of tonal differences so that you don't lose the overall essential flatness of the shapes, but at the same time, you try to capture some feeling of form. And you can see that here on the face. Baxter is using a slightly darker tone over here than on that side of the face. But the difference is so subtle. See a little bit of the shadow underneath the chin here. So you see a difference in tone. That tone is lighter on the chin, and then underneath the chin it gets a little darker because of that shadow. And of course, tonal variations are introduced here on her blouse with this checkerboard pattern. So I brought in another book cover. When you compare this style with that one, you can see sharp differences. Just look at the sculptural looking forms here due to the light and shadow being applied. They look like three-dimensional solid heads. They have volume, while this doesn't have that kind of sculptural look. Two completely different styles, but each is great in their own way. Here's another painting by Robert Baxter. And here again, you see this subtle tonal modeling. Modeling means using various tones to give some form to the shapes. And you see very subtle modeling going on in this book cover illustration. So these are not completely flat-looking shapes. They have some form to them because of this subtle tonal modeling that's going on. And these forms exist within a shallow space. You don't get a feeling of really deep space here. And here again, you can see the extreme difference between this style and that one. You don't see this kind of light and shadow over here on these forms that you do over here. All of Robert Baxter's book covers that he did, he was more concerned with pattern than with creating this kind of more realistic form where strong light and shadow is used. Another beautifully done painting by Baxter. I just love his work. And he used to work for the famous art school as one of the art instructors there. I remember seeing him there. Just a brilliant artist, in my opinion. Here's another wonderfully done book cover illustration by James Hill. And you can see that in this example, the space has been flattened out quite a bit. It's not, of course, completely flat. You still get a feeling of some space because of the differences in sizes between the woman in the foreground and the man in back of her. So this differences in sizes helps to create some feeling of distance or depth, but it's not deep space. It's a more shallow space. But in this example, you can see the artist using completely flat shapes without any tonal modeling. That is a graphic shape. But then when you look at the face over here and the face of the horse and the man, although you don't see much modeling on the man's face because he's further back, you can see that the face has some form to it. It looks a little different in style than the rest of the painting, where more flat shapes are being used. But on the face, the artist wants to give some suggestion of form there, to make the face look more realistic. But he avoids strong light and shadow like you see in that other example over here. Because then there would be too much form, and it wouldn't be as subtle as it is now, and if that were the case, then the face would look completely out of place. It would look too different from the rest of the painting. So in this illustration, James Hill is combining completely flat shapes with shapes that have some form to them. Here you see a page from the famous art school textbook that you see over here on the left. And on this page, right here at the top, you see two different styles, two different approaches to painting the subject. And I'm going to enlarge that section of the page. So here on the left, you see a more realistic interpretation of the subject. While on the right here, the artist interpreted the subject more in terms of flat, abstract shapes. So there are two different styles. One in which textures and form are important in order to be able to create a more realistic looking image, while in the other style or approach, realistic looking forms that have light and shadow on them and texture, like in this example, are not as important. Rather, it's the abstract shapes and the patterns of these abstract shapes that become important. I'm going to read the caption underneath the painting on the left. It says, "The textures in this picture are realistic ones, brought out by the light which strikes the surfaces of the objects. The natural smoothness of the bowl and fruit contrasts with the coarser leaves and the busy pattern of the wallpaper. Note how the textures and edges, which are quite apparent in the light, tend to disappear in the shadow." And now I'll read the caption for the painting on the right, and it says, "This is an abstract version of the same subject. Here, the artist departed from the actual textures and created these original ones to make an interesting personal design. He freely interpreted and emphasized the wallpaper design and the watermelon seeds, and showed the flat pattern rather than the textures on the bowl. Drapery, apples, and leaves have been simplified and reduced to flat shapes." So here you see a more flat approach. Here's a page from one of the textbooks of the famous Artist School art course, and I'm showing you this page because here you see a good example of two different styles or approaches to painting the subject, which is, of course, a fishing theme here. In this approach, the artist is concerned with creating a more realistic space and a more realistic depiction of the subject, while in this example, the artist is being more imaginative and not concerned so much with trying to depict the subject in a more realistic way. Rather, here, a more decorative approach becomes important, and a more limited or flat space is what the artist is concerned with here. While here, the artist is more concerned with the laws of perspective in order to get a more realistic appearance of the subject. When you're learning to draw, most likely, the art instructor is going to be teaching you the laws of perspective in order to draw or paint more realistic looking images like this, rather than talking about and showing you another approach, which is the more flat and limited space approach. So for those of you who have learned a lot about the laws of perspective, and you may not have heard a lot about a more decorative and less realistic approach, so therefore you may never really have given any attention to painting the subject in any other way except in a more realistic approach like this. But if you had learned more about the flat approach, that might have appealed to you even more than trying to paint more realistic looking images like this. This painting exists within this kind of more narrow or limited space. Now, if I wanted a greater sensation of space within the painting than what you see here, then I have to think about extending the volume of space, the amount of space, like this. So I'm going back a bit further. So now I have a greater volume of space in which I can place the objects that I'm painting. They have more space in which to exist, and thereby I can add a bit more form to them. But not too much, because the whole idea of working in a more compressed space is to create a more flat-looking painting, like that. If I wanted to make a painting in which there are forms that have a greater volume to them, more form, then I need more space in which they can exist. But if I am painting objects that don't have a lot of volume to them, then I don't need all that space. I can just flatten out the space because the objects have been flattened out more. The focus is more on the flat shapes rather than on solid three-dimensional or sculptural looking objects. Now, when you're working in this style, you're concerned with establishing two-dimensional shapes. While working in this style, you're concerned with establishing three-dimensional forms. Now, the front of the box right here, with that heavy outline, that is called the picture plane. And the picture plane is two-dimensional, which means, of course, that it has height and it has width, but it has no depth. And in this kind of flat painting, you're concerned mostly with shapes that also are two-dimensional, like this one. This is a two-dimensional shape because it has height and width, but no depth. So if I place that shape within this box, like this, it is parallel to the picture plane because the picture plane is flat and that shape is flat. They're both two-dimensional shapes. Therefore, that shape that I put in there locks to the picture plane. And all other shapes that I put in there that are part of my picture, that are two-dimensional and parallel with the picture plane, lock with the picture plane, or come forward, in other words, to the picture plane. And therefore, all those shapes unify with the picture plane. They become one plane. So when you look at this painting here, all these shapes that you see here, see, they're two-dimensional shapes, like this. They have height and width, and they're facing the picture plane, just like these shapes are facing the picture plane. And therefore, that shape and these other shapes here, they're coming forward and uniting with the picture plane. And this shape here, and this shape, all those shapes that are two-dimensional like that. So this flattens out the picture, or put another way, the design. And this shape here, see, they're all two-dimensional. You're looking at the front of the shape, it's facing the picture plane. Now here's the beauty of this. Even though these shapes are two-dimensional and locking with the picture plane and appear somewhat flat-looking, but not entirely because of the texture that the artist added there. So even though these flat shapes are being used, the artist is still able to create sensation or feeling of a certain amount of space. So how can that be done? How can I create a feeling of spatial depth when using two-dimensional shapes? Well, the way that is done is, take a look over here, what I'm going to do. So I have this two-dimensional shape. It has height and width. But then what I do is I add another shape that is two-dimensional in back of that. Then I add another shape that is two-dimensional in back of that. So what I'm doing, I'm overlapping these shapes, and then I can add an even larger one back here. And even though I have these two-dimensional shapes, I'm creating a feeling or sensation of some space, some spatial depth, but it's not great. And it's not supposed to be, because I'm applying the more flat approach, the more flat style. And the sensation of deep space is reduced because of the size of the shapes getting larger as they move back, instead of the other way around, getting smaller as they move back. So what I've done is I've reversed perspective here. Thereby, I'm flattening out the space. So I enlarged the painting. This painting, by the way, was done by John Atherton, who was one of the guiding faculty members for the famous artist school. And here you can clearly see the flat shapes that he's using. He used this concept of overlapping shapes, like I showed you over here, to create some feeling of depth or spatial distance. But it's a very limited space in order to keep things more flat looking. Now, he didn't enlarge the shapes as they moved further back like I did here, because you can see the large size of the boat here compared to other sizes like you see over here and here, which are smaller and further back. So this helps to create more space, a greater feeling of space. So this flat approach is not completely devoid of creating some depth or space. Thereby, you can employ these other concepts of having larger shapes in the foreground and smaller ones in the back, like he did here. But if you wanted to compress the space more and bring the shapes that are further back forward more, that's when you then employ this concept here, where I enlarged the background shape right here. I enlarged that and made the other shapes in the foreground smaller. That brings that big shape forward more, which creates less of a feeling of space or depth, but there's still some feeling of depth here because of the overlapping of shapes that is occurring. And that's what Atherton applies here, in addition to having the larger shape in the foreground. He overlaps shapes, and thereby that also helps to create some feeling or sense of depth so that the painting or design doesn't look completely flat. So it exists in a certain amount of limited space. So in effect, what he's doing, he is combining some perspective, some laws of perspective, with the more flat approach. And to keep everything more flat, to keep the shapes looking more flat, he doesn't add any gradations in there. Like you see the side of the boat here. It's just one large white shape. There's no tonal gradation. Like, for example, if I did something like this. By adding a tonal gradation from darker to light, that would create a feeling of form. It would remove this feeling of a flat shape. So therefore, in order to avoid having your design look like it has form, you need to eliminate or at least minimize any gradations. Keep everything more flat, like you see the shape in the foreground here. There's no tonal gradations, no modeling of forms, in other words. I should also mention that he does combine some form with the flatness. So where's the form? Well, you can see it back here, for example. See, there's a cast shadow here. There's some slight tonal variations within the tree. You see the same thing here and over here. Those look more realistic compared to the boat, which looks more abstract and flat. So he's actually combining form with flatness. You see the flatness here, though, and on the fish, they look flat. Flat shapes are used. This creates a lot of variety, and because of that, it makes this design even more interesting than if you just used flat shapes throughout without this addition of some form here and texture. The boat doesn't have any texture, but the trees have texture. So he's combining flatness, no texture, with texture, which again helps to add even more interest to this design. So he's breaking some rules here, but the result is something that looks visually interesting. And what he's doing is he's placing an empty shape next to a textured shape. In other words, busy next to quiet, which adds interest. So Atherton is combining both flatness with depth, but not a great deal of depth or deep space. Here is another painting, and this one was done by one of my favorite illustrators. He's become a fine artist now, Robert Baxter. And in this painting, here again you can see this style in which the artist decided to use a more flat approach, a more compressed space, like I showed you over here. Now, just as with Atherton's painting that you saw, this painting, while it has a two-dimensionality to it, it also has a three-dimensionality as well. So, just like what I explained over here, the painting can have both the two-dimensional as well as the three-dimensional. It can be both more flat as well as suggest or have a certain degree of space and some indication of form. So it doesn't look like all of the shapes are graphic shapes, just flat with no tonal variation whatsoever. In this painting by Baxter, he uses two-dimensional shapes that are parallel to the picture plane, just like what I showed you here, thereby compressing the space and not having deep space like over here. You see, going way back like that is deep space, but he compresses that space like I showed you over here. Thereby, this is a more limited or more flat space, not completely flat because there's still some depth here. So he's combining flatness and depth. So where's the flatness? Well, look at the shapes here. You see, that is a two-dimensional shape, just like what I pointed out over here. It has height and it has width, but it doesn't really have any depth, and therefore that shape is parallel with the picture plane, just like what I showed you with these shapes, which are parallel to the picture plane, and lock onto the picture plane because of that. So he uses a more flat shape over here as well. You see, again, there's height and there's width, but there's no depth. It's a flat two-dimensional shape. Let me draw that again in green so you can see it better. And the same goes over here. That shape is a two-dimensional shape. It limits the degree of depth. The eye stops right here where those two-dimensional shapes are. The eye cannot continue further back into space like over here, because those two-dimensional shapes or planes, they stop the eye. And therefore, this space that Baxter creates is a more shallow space or limited space, just like what I did over here. And you see this shape is a two-dimensional shape, like those others that I pointed out to you. It relates to the picture plane. It's a flat shape. Even her pantsuit over here looks more flat because Baxter doesn't add any tonal variations or gradations of tone. So therefore, the shape looks more flat. But when you look over here, you see some indication of form. There's some tonal variation going on. But right here, there isn't. And over here, there isn't. It's just a flat, dark shape like that. And over here also, you see that bit of the tree? That's a flat shape. There's slight tonal variations, but nevertheless, it still looks like a flat shape. It's not going into space. And on her hair, you can see some form indicated because of the differences in tone that he adds here. Some depth is suggested here by the diagonal that's going back here and on the bench. See those diagonals? When you add a diagonal like this into the painting, that suggests depth. So he's not doing a painting that's completely flat without any suggestion of depth at all. No, that's not the case. He combines flatness with depth or space. But remember, it's a limited space. It's not deep space. It's a more flat space. Or a better description is a more compressed space. It's not completely flat because there's still some depth here, some space, in which these shapes and forms exist. And this shape, as a matter of fact, extends up more. You see, up to here and down. It's a rectangle. The umbrella over here suggests some form, some depth. It's not completely flat. This, of course, is flat. The pattern on the clothing here. And this shape is not completely flat because you see some tonal variations. It's darker over here, lighter over here, darker here, lighter there. In this kind of more flat approach, what becomes most important is the pattern. And pattern is flat. The artist uses flat patterns of light and dark and middle tone. Pattern is design. And in these kind of paintings, the local color and local value are what becomes important, which make the pattern. So it's more of a tonal approach of more flat tones, but not entirely. And this style I find extremely appealing visually. Now, this is a style that may appeal to you, rather than a more realistic approach in which you use the laws of perspective to create more realism. Baxter also flattens out the space more by adding saturated color back here. See how saturated that red is and that orange? Saturated color comes forward, while desaturated color moves back into space. But because those colors are rather saturated, they come forward, thereby compressing the space more. Now, he also uses some of the perspective laws, just like in the previous example. So where are they? What is he using? Well, as you can see, there's a large shape here in the foreground, and then the shapes get smaller as they move further back, like that. So that's a law of perspective. Shapes, like this, get smaller as they move further back in space. In addition to that, to create a feeling of space, he also overlaps the shapes, just like what I showed you over here, or what you can see here, overlapping of shapes. This shape overlaps the man sitting here. This shape of her overlaps the woman over here. The man overlaps the bench and the boy back here, part of the boy. So you see he's also applying some of these principles of perspective, because he still wants to create a certain amount of space to give the viewer a sense of some depth here. He doesn't want the painting to be completely flat. So you can combine perspective with flatness, flatness with form, and the result can be a rather decorative and visually appealing painting like this. So I brought back Atherton's painting here just to point something out. You see, these shapes, they look more graphic, more flat than the shapes that Baxter has in his painting. So Atherton carries these shapes to a greater degree of flatness by not adding any kind of tonal variations within these shapes here, and just keeping them more graphic-like, just flat abstract shapes. So you can take it to that extreme, or you can do more of what Baxter's doing here. Both paintings, however, are still embracing the more shallow space and a more flat approach. And here are a couple more paintings by Robert Baxter. And again, Baxter uses a more shallow space with more flat-looking shapes within that shallow space. So you can have more flat-looking shapes within a shallow space. And when you make more flat-looking shapes, the whole painting has more of a flat look to it, but those shapes exist within a certain amount of space. The shapes are kept more flat because Baxter doesn't add strong light and shadow on them. That's how you keep the shapes more flat looking, by not adding strong light and shadow. If he added strong light and shadow like this, then that would stand out too much and it wouldn't look like it belongs with the rest of the forms and shapes, which are more flat. So a consistency of style is applied. And you see the same thing over here in this other painting. More flat shapes and forms that don't look too sculptural. And you see the same thing happening here in these flowers. Everything looks more flat. He's using more flat shapes within a limited space. These shapes here, they all appear more flat. He's flattening out the entire space so that everything looks more flat rather than too sculptural. He's really reduced the space here to a much greater degree, and by doing that he flattens out everything. I think these are just stunningly beautiful. This kind of visual beauty is not just a result of these more shallow spatial concepts that are being applied and this more flat look, but it's also because of the principles of design that he's able to apply. And the focus is on pattern, color patterns, and value patterns. Baxter flattens out this space more because he's adding this two-dimensional shape. See, it has height and width. It looks flat. It doesn't look like it's receding back into space, which it would look like if he had darkened the foreground and then the value gets gradually lighter as it moves further back into space. This is what would happen if he applied atmospheric perspective. See, now this looks like there's some depth here. It doesn't look as flat as it did before I added that gradation of tone, like this. That looks more flat, and this doesn't. If he had added this gradation of tone, then it wouldn't be in the style of the rest of the painting. It would look out of place because it doesn't look more flat like all of the other shapes do. Even though these paintings are done in a more flat style, there's still a suggestion of depth here. So how's that depth achieved, even though a more flat approach is being used? Well, Baxter applies some of the rules of perspective, like, for example, adding larger shapes in the foreground, like this character here, who is overlapping that character and the chair that he's sitting in. And then this figure is overlapping that one there, and she's also overlapping the figure in back of her right there. So this diminishing of sizes helps to create a feeling of some space here, some depth, in addition to the overlapping of shapes that is occurring. When you overlap shapes, you create a feeling of depth. And the same thing is happening in this painting. Baxter is applying overlaps to create a feeling of depth. So she is overlapping the chair here. The paper she's reading is overlapping her and the chair. And she is overlapping this flower garden in back of her. So there is some suggestion of depth, which means that there is some space here. But it's a very shallow space, a more flattened space. However, in this painting, the feeling of space is greater because of this diminishing of sizes of the shapes.
The entire figure, this hockey player, is made up of simple, abstract, or flat shapes.
Here's an illustration that was done in that more flat style. This was done by Kobe Whitmore, another one of my favorite illustrators. And you can see the more flat approach here, the more flat shapes. However, these are not completely flat. They are not graphic shapes. There is some modeling going on within these shapes, which means that there are some tonal variations or changes that have been introduced. But when you introduce these kind of tonal variations or modeling, it's kept to a minimum. It's kept very subtle, so as not to destroy the overall more flat look. Too much modeling would destroy the flatness of the shapes. So let me give you an example here. So I have these two shapes. This one here, I'm going to add a tone to it. And then I'm going to add some subtle modeling. That is, I'm introducing some different tones, a bit darker, like that. But not too much of this modeling is going on. The tones are kept close together, so as not to destroy a feeling of a more flat shape. However, over here on the other shape, what I'm going to do is something like this. And then I'm going to add some additional tones, like this. Add a lighter tone over here. It gets gradually darker as it moves toward the shadow side. So here you see more form being indicated because of these gradations of tone from lighter to dark. There's light and shadow here. And therefore you get a greater feeling of a more three-dimensional form here than you do here. See, that shape looks more flat, while this looks more three-dimensional. So in this kind of more flat painting, this kind of form created with stronger light and shadow is largely avoided, and more subtle modeling of the shapes, like you see here, is used, so as not to destroy the essential flatness of the shape. Although it's not completely flat. If it was completely flat, it would be a graphic shape and it would look like this. And here there's no hint whatsoever of any kind of form. It's just a flat shape. But that's not what is done in this style. Although you can do that, you can introduce flat shapes like that in addition to more subtle modeling. But this kind of modeling that you see here, where there's light and shadow, creating a strong sense or feeling of a three-dimensional form, that is largely avoided. When there is this kind of modeling going on, it is minimized. It's not very strong, so you don't have strong light and shadow. You have more subtle light and shadow. And that's what's being applied in this illustration. And here again, the more flat approach is being used, where the local values and local colors are used rather than strong light and shadow modeling, creating strong form. Here, everything is kept more flat, except on the arm and face. So you can see some indication of form here. The shadow under her jaw, subtle shadow on her face here and on her eye, the arm here, and where the hand is, there's a shadow, thereby creating subtle form, not strong three-dimensional form with strong light and shadow, but more subtle modeling, resulting in form. But then other parts like here and here and here in the background, they're kept more flat and you don't see that kind of modeling to create some form. Kobe is combining the more flat with form. You can do that if you keep the modeling of the form more subtle, like you see here. Or sometimes it can be increased a little bit more. Another beautiful illustration in the more flat style. In this wonderful cover illustration done by Franklin McMahon for the famous Artist magazine, you can see this concept applied, keep background and foreground the same. So, where is it to be found? When it comes to value, the value of the white sail in the foreground is repeated in the value of the sail that is further back, as well as that sail and over here. So the same value of white that you see in the foreground, you see in the background. Again, this flattens out the space more. In more realistic space, that is, when you want to create the greater feeling of depth, you would have the darker values in the foreground, and then they would gradually get lighter as they move further back. But that's not the case here. Franklin McMahon is using flat shapes. There's no modeling on these shapes here to turn them into forms. Shapes are flat. Once you apply light and shadow, they turn into forms. But here, McMahon is using these flat shapes, which helps to flatten out the space. So he doesn't use any kind of gradation on the sails, for example, like this, which would indicate form. And also the other sail back here, there's no shadow like that, for example. And that helps to create some feeling of volume. But he doesn't do that because he keeps everything more flat. See how immediately you get a feeling of form, of volume here because of the light and shadow? The same thing for the boat. If I added a gradation of tone here, greater feeling of form would result. And the same for the sails in the background, like this. And that yellow sail back there. It's a more decorative style. Now what's interesting to note here is that even though he's using spatial concepts that bring the shapes more forward toward the picture plane, he's also creating more deep space. See, the sailboats are going back into the distance, and they're getting gradually smaller. So he's applying this spatial concept up here, overlapping of planes. In addition, he also uses the spatial concept of diminishing of sizes. The sailboats get smaller and smaller as they move further and further back into deep space. So here you can say that McMahon is actually combining more flat space with more deep space, resulting in a very interesting looking style. Now here's another example of the artist flattening out space. This wonderful cover illustration done by Lorraine Fox shows a more flattened space. She flattens out the space more by having the various planes become more parallel to the picture plane. That is, she moves them closer to the picture plane, thereby flattening out the space more. Now the viewpoint is that you're looking down on the scene somewhat, but perfect scientific perspective is not applied here. When you look at the floor and the checkerboard, they look more like they are parallel with the picture plane rather than receding back like this to some vanishing point on the horizon. See these lines? They're more vertical. So the top plane of the table here seems to be somewhat tilted upward more toward the picture plane, thereby flattening out the space more. just like with the floor and the checkerboard pattern. There is still, however, some suggestion of depth here, so this is not completely flat. The fact that there's overlapping going on, like the table overlapping with the chair here, helps to create some feeling of depth. Thereby, she's applying this spatial concept up here, overlapping planes. And of course, you see some overlapping going on the table, right here, for example. I do want to say something about her use of color, which is so wonderful. She creates this beautiful harmony of color. So how does she do that? Well, I'm just going to quickly point something out. She's applying color rhythm. Now, if you're not familiar with how to create color rhythm, I can't really go into that a lot here, but it's the color rhythm that she's employing which helps to create this beautiful harmony of color. So essentially what is done is applying what is called hue rhythm, intensity rhythm, and value rhythm, which are, of course, the three dimensions of color, but you create rhythms of those dimensions, which is what she's doing. So when it comes to hue rhythm, you select one color, like she did, green, and then you select another hue that is very closely related to the first hue. So you can see over here where the little color selector is, right there, that when I click on the different greens, see they change. Yellow green, and this is more of a green, this is more of a blue-green. They all contain green, however, and this hue rhythm is created because of these slight differences in the green hue. And this hue rhythm creates this beautiful harmony of color. So you can take one color, like she did, one green, and then create all these variations of that one green color. Green, yellow-green, blue-green, like this, and blue-green, creating this hue rhythm. But they all need to be closely related. They all need to contain green, for example, in this case. So this is just a quick little lesson on color rhythm. She was also on the guiding faculty for the famous artist school. This style of hers also results in a more decorative looking illustration. I want to give you a quick example here of the tilting of planes toward the picture plane. So let's say this is the picture plane right here, two-dimensional surface, and then there's a plane, let's say, within your illustration like this, and it's not lying flat on the ground. But as you can see, I've tilted it, I've moved it up like that from the ground level, and now it's getting closer to the picture plane, the flat picture plane. And that helps to flatten out the space, make the space more shallow. The more that plane parallels the flat picture plane, the more shallow or more flat the space becomes. And that's what Lorraine Fox is doing here in her illustration. She's tilted the plane of the table here, the top of the table, forward toward the picture plane like what you see here. Here's another illustration. This one was done by the great Mark English, and I love this illustration. And Mark English is using a more shallow space because the scene is taking place within a room, so maybe the space is something like this. But he's not using light and shadow in this case. The shapes are more flat, placed within a more shallow space, and he's more interested in using more flat tones for the shapes rather than using light and shadow, although you see some light and shadow over here on her arm. But there's hardly a suggestion of light and shadow there. He's mainly interested in more flat shapes, but they're not perfectly flat because there is subtle modeling going on there, subtle differences of tone that you see here and here on the dress, for example. But the idea here is that he's more interested in showing what the local color and local values of the various shapes are, rather than showing strong light and shadow patterns. And because of that, he flattens out the entire illustration more. But in spite of that, there is still a feeling of space here, because of the overlapping that is going on, which again is this concept up here that he's applying overlapping planes to create a feeling of space. So again, like some of the other artists, he's combining both space as well as a more flat approach. You can have more flat shapes, but when you overlap those shapes, you also create a feeling of space. Thereby, you are combining both flatness as well as space. I'm going to turn this into a black and white so you can see the subtle differences in tone. While these shapes look flat, like that and her, there is still some subtle differences of tone, as you can see over here and here. But because those differences are very subtle, the overall shape appears more flat looking. Just a wonderful illustration, I think. Beautifully done by one of the great illustration masters. In this illustration done by Al Parker, one of the guiding faculty members for the famous artist school, you can see this idea of using more flat shapes carried further than what Mark English did. So, for example, when you look at this dark shape here, you don't really see that kind of subtle tonal modeling that I pointed out to you in Mark English's work. This is just a flat graphic shape. And the same for this shape here, as well as the shape of the girl's dress here. Now, what Parker does, in addition to applying these flat shapes, because he's more interested in showing what the local color and local value is, over these flat shapes, he applies line, and you can see the line here in the folds of the dress. And he does this a lot in his illustrations, where he uses more flat shapes because he's more interested in the tonal mass, mass referring to value or tone, more flat tones. But then he adds line over those flat shapes. And the line that he adds also helps to suggest form, that there's some dimension there. It's not completely flat. Here's another example of one of Parker's illustrations in which he applies the flat local color that you see here, for example, on the man's coat, and on the woman's jacket, just a flat shape, and the woman's dress, a flat shape to which he adds a pattern. But then over that flat tone of the man's coat, he adds line. You see these lines? So it's line over tone. So that line added creates form. You get the feeling that there is some form here. It's not completely flat. That's why the line is added over the flat shape of tone. And you see the same thing with the hat over here. Flat tone, and then he adds the line over the tone. So it's line over mass, mass referring to tone. Space here is more shallow, but nevertheless there is a feeling of shallow space because of the overlapping of shapes that is going on here, and the smaller sizes in the background with the larger sizes in the foreground, smaller size of the bird cage back there. This was done by Bob Peak, and looking at this illustration, you might think, well, this must be a rough color sketch that Bob Peak did. No, this is the finished illustration. This is one of his styles. And here, he's not interested in creating strong light and shadow to create a greater feeling of volume or form. He's more interested, like the other artist that I showed you, in showing what the local color and local value are rather than light and shadow, because he was more interested in creating a more flat look, which results in pattern becoming more important. When you use this more flat approach, the result also is that a more decorative looking illustration results. And here again, the space is more shallow. It has been flattened out more. There's no suggestion of deep space here. Everything is closer to the picture plane. Therefore, the space becomes more shallow. The fact that you don't see anything here, just this empty negative shape, brings it forward toward the picture plane. It becomes more parallel with the picture plane, thereby flattening out the space more. But even so, there's some suggestion of depth. The fact that there is the dark value here against the lighter value of the background suggests some depth. And of course, the fact that there's overlapping going on. The foreground Indian is overlapping the Indian in back of them, which further helps to create a feeling of space. Now, there is some suggestion of depth right here, you see, because of the value change that occurs. It's a little darker here, and then it gets lighter moving back. So some suggestion of depth is suggested here, in which these figures exist.
Now it's time to end this long video. If you were able to watch the entire video, either in one session or several sessions, congratulations to you. That tells me that you have that strong desire that is needed in order to learn what you need to know to become a really good or even great artist. And the 10-15-minute crowd, well, those we lost long ago. Lots of luck to them in ever finding this kind of information. If they ever decide that they want to paint in this more semi-abstract style, I doubt very much that they'll ever come across this information in the way that I've presented this information and the way I've shown it. So without this information, then you really don't know what you're doing. You don't know what goes into the making of these kind of semi-realistic looking abstract paintings that so many of the great artists worked in, either fine artists or illustrators. And of course, if after you've seen all of this and you learned what I had to say about this subject, and then you just move on to another video and you forget all about this and you don't try to apply this to your own painting, well, then of course you're never going to be able to paint in this sort of style, because you will have forgotten everything or almost everything that you've learned. It's only when you actually try to apply these concepts to painting that you can then remember them. You won't forget them. To be told something is to forget it. To be told something and to see what it's like, that will help you to remember. But to be engaged, that is to actually do what you've learned, that's how you really remember. That's how it becomes part of your long-term memory. And you'll find these concepts getting into your art. Otherwise, watching these kind of videos is just a waste of time if that's all you're doing is just watching and you never actually try to apply what you've learned. Now, you might think, well, I've learned everything. No, you haven't, because there's still more to learn. I haven't really covered one of the important aspects of this kind of painting, which is pattern. And there are other things that you need to know about in greater depth and more detail that are part of this kind of style of painting. And of course, you need to know what all those principles of design are and how to apply them. So to learn those additional things, you might want to consider taking my complete illustration art course, where you'll learn those additional things that I just can't cover in one video like this. And now, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, please subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate that. Also, since I'm not very well known, please help me to get the word around about my videos, about my online art academy school, so that other students have an opportunity to see my videos and learn what I teach and how I teach. In addition, besides my complete illustration art course, I have a mini course on composition that I put together based on the textbook that the great illustrator Austin Briggs put together for the famous artist schools, and you'll find a link down below to that video. Also, I have another art course that has been designed specifically for young people ages 12 and up, and you'll find a link to that course down below. Then I also have videos at my ArtStation page, which you might want to check out. And again, there's a link down below to ArtStation, where you'll find those videos. And I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this long video and that you found it informative, and that if this style appeals to you even more than the more realistic style, that you'll try to paint in this style. And you might find that this style comes more easily to you. And you might gain more enjoyment working in this sort of style rather than the more realistic style. That, of course, is up to you, what kind of style you want to work in. And also, of course, a style is the result of what your personality is like, what your temperament is like. It is a reflection of who you are. And if you see yourself in this more semi-abstract style of painting, then I would say that that is the style for you. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and if you have something to say, please leave a comment. Also, if there isn't enough interest in this video, then I probably won't keep it at my YouTube channel, since I do sometimes remove my videos from my YouTube channel. So if you watch this video again, you might want to consider taking notes, just in case I might remove this video. And now, thank you very much for taking the time to watch this long video. And as always, I say to you, adios, until next time.